Did I perfectly theory craft one of the 5 best decks of the expansion? I actually did. Let's talk about it.
Hey buddy, watch this.
Yeah, in this video we're going to talk about the 5 best decks in Rise of Shadows right now, and I really did predict the best version of one of those in my theory crafting before the expansion. So the decks in this video are essentially going to be the decks that have stood out so far. These are the ones that are looking like they're going to be those tier 1, high tier 2 staples. And if you're looking for a good deck to play, you're going to find a lot of good decks in this list, and you can even find the deck lists in the description below. That said, let's go ahead and jump into the very best deck in Rise of Shadows right now. So up first here at the number 1 spot, we have Token Druid, and I've got 2 lists here. The one on the left is the most popular right now, and I have seen a lot of different variations of Token Druid. This is the one most people are playing according to HS Replay, but the one on the right actually has the highest win rate with a pretty significant sample size too, so you might find yourself succeeding a little more if you venture towards this slightly more unusual list on the right with cards like Force of Nature, Eccentric Scribe, which blows my mind, and Microtech Controller. A couple different ways there to just give you a lot of reload minion potential wide board stuff, which is clearly what Token Druid likes to do. You're building up the board, protecting that board, and then using buffs like Power of the Wild, the new Blessing of the Ancients, and Savage Roar to hopefully just overwhelm your opponent with lots and lots of damage. And because there aren't a lot of good AoE board clears in the meta right now, decks like this can succeed. You got to be careful. Those Warpaths out there I think can be a problem. But obviously this deck has carved its way to the top spot for a reason, because it's winning games and it's working. And although I'm sure this won't be the final list, it becomes kind of the go-to standard for this deck. You can probably gain a little bit of an edge right now if you play either of these, frankly, but the one on the right, you know, tweak it a little bit here and there to your liking, but it seems like this one's doing something to be one of the very best decks in the game right now. Moving on to the number 2 spot here, we have Bomb Warrior, and this is no surprise if you've been playing Hearthstone at all in the Rise of Shadows meta. These guys are absolutely everywhere, and I do think this deck is going to stay good. It just does a lot of great things. Warrior has good cards. The bombs themselves can be oppressive, but it's really, I think, the Dr. Boom and Mech synergies that make this deck so strong. I wouldn't be shocked if a Control Warrior variant of this became more popular and more prominent in the meta as Rise of Shadows persists. That's already a deck that's ranking very highly on HS Replay and seems to be trending upwards. So keep your eyes out for a shift in the focus of this deck, maybe away from bombs and more towards control. They might end up landing somewhere in the middle. We'll just have to see. But here we have the current most popular version of Bomb Warrior on the left, which I believe is actually just Kriparian's list that he theory crafted very early on in the pre-release stuff. And people are playing that to great success. It's working very well. There is a slightly higher win rate version over here on the right, which makes a few interesting changes, like cutting Omega Devastator. That shocks me. I thought that card was amazing, but adding in Militia Commander in its spot instead is actually leading to higher win rates, which, when I think about it, kind of makes sense, right? Omega Devastator is only really good very late in the game, and if you're playing a deck that is a little bit more on the aggressive side, because you're just creating a lot of tempo and pressure with bombs, then perhaps a card like Militia Commander that helps you keep up in the mid-game, maybe shut down aggressive decks a little harder, can pay dividends a lot faster than a card like Omega Devastator. It serves the same sort of purpose, removing something and playing a minion, perhaps, taking a value trade, essentially. Not quite as big, but more efficient, more early, more reliable, perhaps, and consistent. So that works out in its favor. Now, both of these lists do have cards like Darius Crowley. The one on the left has Captain Greenskin, so they are, you know, not super control focused. They do have a little bit more tempo built into them. But that's really only one of a handful of differences between the two. They're mostly trying to accomplish the same sorts of things, and they're both working very well. But if you want to play the best version, technically right now, the one on the right is the way to go. So now let's move on to Tempo Rogue at the number 3 spot, the 3rd best deck currently in Rise of Shadows. And this one's a deck with a lot of different variations, a ton of different ways to play. And although the 2 lists here on screen will look rather similar to one another, you might have trouble finding the difference between these two. There are a ton of different decks and deck styles you can play for. So for instance, King Togwaggle is a pretty prominent choice in a lot of decks. And frankly, you can play Togwaggle lists that are very good. We're talking about, you know, maybe 1 to 3% differences between all of these different decks. So none of them are going to like ruin your chances of hitting legend. You can succeed with all of them. The differences here are about maximizing those, little 1 or 2% differences. These, of course, do not run King Togwaggle. Another popular card is Myra's Unstable Element. Nobody's running Myra's Unstable Element in either of these lists, but a lot of people do have Myra's base lists as well. Now, the game plan for these decks, if you're just not familiar with it at all, is essentially to play out good, strong, early tempo cards, do crazy things with prep to cheat out things that aren't supposed to be possible, get big minions with Edwin Van Cleef, play some really high tempo Dread Corsair and Waggle Pick plays where you just swing the board super hard, start hitting your opponent in the face with, just early game chunk damage, and then finish them off with all kinds of crazy Leroy Shadow Step shenanigans or Waggle Pick Leroy shenanigans or just tons of Waggle Pick damage. You can kill your opponent really quickly while still maintaining the board through your backstabs and your vendettas and your really cheap Dread Corsairs, etc. So this is truly a real tempo deck, not just sort of a board deck, but a tempo deck where you can swing things super hard, super fast, and overwhelm your opponent. And it's working very well right now in Hearthstone, and I think a lot of pros are trending towards this deck. They like playing Rogue successfully, I think. So a deck that will remain, I'm sure, a tier 1 list for now. I don't see anything supplanting this one in the future, but between these two lists, the difference, in case you didn't see it, is there is a sap in one and an acidic swamp ooze in the other. So perhaps your tech card of choice here, whatever you're seeing in your little local pocket meta, you can adjust this outside of the key package with like vendettas and raiding parties and Dread Corsairs and Henchman Burglars and Leroys and Waggle Picks. You can make some changes here and there and not totally break this deck, but clearly something that is successful with a lot of different changes, and it doesn't hurt the deck too much. So feel free to take this one and customize it to your liking. So up next here at the number 4 spot, we have Murloc Shaman. And this one's not a surprise. When we saw Scargill and Underbelly Angler and Toxfin and Sludge Slurper and Soul of the Murloc, all these really strong looking Murloc cards, you're like, okay, this is definitely going to work. This is going to be a deck. And in fact, it is one of the 5 best decks in Rise of Shadows so far. Pretty obvious game plan for this deck. Just play a ton of Murlocs as fast as you can. Reload a little bit with Underbelly Anglers, Scargills, Murloc Tasty Fins. Go again, protect your board with Soul of the Murloc, and eventually kill your opponent with Bloodlust. That's a traditional kind of Murloc plan, but it's just better than ever in this exact deck. So we have the most popular version of Murloc Shaman here on the left. This one works very well, can win a lot of games, but the highest win rate version of Murloc Shaman, so the best of the 4th best deck in the expansion, is exactly the list that I theory crafted like a week before the expansion came out. The main differences in my deck are Hagatha the Witch, which might seem crazy in an aggro deck. Beyond that, also HinchClan Hag and HinchClan Hogsteed are fairly unusual choices for most of the Murloc Shaman builds you'll see out there, but I think they add some important elements. Hagatha's there, of course, to give this deck a little bit more reload potential. You already have this kind of mid-game reload shift happening with Scargill and Angler where you can go for a 2nd or 3rd wave of Murlocs. And then with Hagatha, each of your Murlocs in the late game, once you've played Hagatha, kind of give you like a 4th or a 5th wind where you can just keep doing things and maybe stretch out a win that you're not supposed to win. So she adds that extra little mid-game, mid-range oomph to this deck that apparently is actually finding a lot of success because the data says this is the best version of Murloc Shaman right now in Rise of Shadows. So HinchClan Hag's another kind of mid-game minion that shifts the curve a little bit later, and all of those things seem to be working really well for this list. So sure enough, the Regis Kilbin Murloc Shaman is the best version of the 4th best archetype in Rise of Shadows. And then finally here, our 5th best deck so far in Rise of Shadows is the Mech Death Rattle Hunter. Most popular version here on the left. Zul'jin, of course, making the cut. A lot of people have made fun of me for not putting Zul'jin in mine lately. But we can see here a list that does look a little bit reminiscent of the Death Rattle Hunter of old, just swapping in Oblivitron for Katharina and a mech package instead of a big beast package. And you've got yourself a deck that can pull off a lot of shenanigans, summoning crazy things onto the board, getting a lot of 7/7s out of your mechanical whelps. You've got Zul'jin there to help you get a lot of 9 lives value, a new card that's really cool, and essentially it's a deck that just finds a lot of ways to overwhelm your opponent and then win games. If it doesn't do it with Oblivitron, it can often do it with Zul'jin. So a really cool list. Now, I will note that the list here on the right, the highest win rate list, as opposed to the most popular, actually changes a lot about this deck. I would argue it's almost a different deck entirely. It does have death rattles and it has mechs, so it's living in a little bit of the same space, but it's a total different take because it's much more aggro based. Whereas the list on the left feels like a mid-range deck where you really hit your power turns around like 5, 6, 7. The list on the right is just curving out with aggressive mechs. You've got Mecharoo, Bomb Toss, Venomizer, Whirliglider. You're summoning a ton of Goblin Bombs in particular, using the Goblin Bomb Death Rattles to overwhelm your opponent with raw damage and pressure, reloading with things like Ursatrons, you're still keeping cards in hand, playing big magnetic stuff with Replicating Menace, and then War Gear to just do tons of damage too. But then, you know, you've got Leroy Jenkins and Boom Master Flark there as well to just give you all the late game damage that you need. So I'm actually almost hesitant to include these. Now, HS Replay did put these in the same bracket, but they're obviously not similar lists at all. But nonetheless, this version on the right of Mech Aggro Hunter, almost is what I'd call it, is actually working really well right now in Rise of Shadows and could be a sleeper deck that would give you a huge advantage on your opponents, because they might see cards like Mecharoo and think, oh, I've got till turn 6 or 7 for this game to matter, and then you just hammer them with magnetic mechs and damage and pressure, and it gives you a really nice advantage. So a little bit of a secret sleeper deck here that might give you an edge right now in Rise of Shadows. And there you go, folks. That's my breakdown of the 5 best decks right now in Rise of Shadows. Now, obviously, we're only 4 or 5 days into the meta. All these things can change, but I do think each of these decks just looks fundamentally strong. I don't see anything taking their place. They might fall a few spots. They might shift around a little bit. One might take the crown one week, fall the next, but they're still going to be strong decks. So I think if you want to commit some dust to these decks, maybe don't go crazy, but at this point, I think you can rely on these to at least be consistent now. Maybe they fall to tier 3, maybe you hate me, but you'll still find some fun and find some wins in decks like those. That said, if you guys have thoughts, questions, observations on this deck, if you just want to pat me on the back for predicting a list exactly in a theory crafting phase, well, please feel free. I appreciate it. But until then, thank you so very much for watching, and until next time, game on.